Before my only daughter walked down the aisle, I went to a custom suit shop in downtown Dallas for a fitting. Out of nowhere, the owner, a man I trusted for decades, grabbed my arm, shoved me into a pitch-black fitting room, and whispered, "There are things you need to know. Stay here, do not say a word. Trust me." I was completely confused, but I stayed quiet. Minutes later, the voices I heard through the thin mahogany paneling left me entirely frozen in place, my blood turning to absolute ice. "My name is Harrison Gallagher. I am 70 years old. I am a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years building commercial skyscrapers across Texas. I know how to spot a hairline crack in a foundation long before the entire building collapses. But God help me, I never saw the fatal crack in my own family until I was standing in the dark of that fitting room, listening to my future son-in-law calmly plot the murder of my only child. Tell me where you are listening from in the comments, and subscribe to hear how I tore this monster's life apart. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days before the wedding. My daughter Maya was the center of my universe. Since my wife Martha passed away 7 years ago, Maya was all I had left. She was 32 years old, running her own art gallery, and blindingly happy. She was engaged to Preston Cole. Preston was 35, flashy, drove a European sports car, and wore expensive designer clothes. He claimed to be a wealthy tech investor from the East Coast. He had a smooth way of talking that felt a little too practiced, but Maya looked at him like he hung the moon. As a father, you try to suppress your cynicism when you see your daughter glowing with pure happiness. I wanted to believe he was a good man. I was paying for the entire wedding at an exclusive country club because I wanted to give her the world. That Tuesday, I drove my truck down to Dominic Rossi's tailor shop. Dominic is a master tailor and a close friend I have known for 25 years. When I walked through the glass doors of his shop, the brass bell chimed, and Dominic looked up from a large bolt of dark silk. The color instantly drained from his face. He rushed over, flipped the sign on the door to closed, and locked the deadbolt. Before I could ask what on earth was going on, he grabbed me tightly by the shoulders and forcefully steered me toward the back of the shop. Dominic pushed me into the deepest VIP fitting room, the one with heavy velvet curtains and solid mahogany walls. He looked me dead in the eye, his hands physically shaking on my arms. He told me to stay in the dark, to not make a single sound, no matter what I heard. He closed the door and locked it from the outside. I was furious and totally disoriented. I almost banged my fists on the wood, thinking my old friend had finally lost his mind. But then I heard the front door of the shop unlock and open. The brass bell chimed again. Footsteps echoed loudly on the hardwood floor. 2 pairs of shoes. I recognized the voices immediately. It was Preston, my future son-in-law, and Valerie. Valerie was Preston's older sister and his supposed business partner. She had flown into town a week ago to help with the wedding preparations. They walked right past my fitting room and stopped in the adjacent lounge area separated from me by nothing but an inch of decorative wood paneling. I stood there, in the pitch dark, holding my breath, waiting to hear about what was so incredibly urgent that Dominic had to lock me away like a criminal. I thought maybe Preston was having financial trouble, or maybe there was some minor social scandal he wanted to hide from me. I was a practical man, fully prepared to solve a problem. I was absolutely not prepared for pure evil. Preston spoke first, his voice completely devoid of the charming, respectful tone he always used when speaking with me and Maya. He let out a low, arrogant laugh that made my stomach turn. He told Valerie they did not need to look at any fabric swatches today. He said the old man is completely clueless. He will sign the medical power of attorney at the rehearsal dinner, thinking it is just a standard trust fund setup to avoid taxes. I pressed my ear flat against the cold wood, my brow furrowing in the darkness. We had discussed a family trust to protect Maya's inheritance, but a medical power of attorney was never part of the original plan. Why would Preston need control over Maya's medical decisions? Valerie replied, her voice cold and sharp as a razor blade. She told Preston that was very good. She said as soon as the ink dries on that document, the $10 million life insurance policy becomes completely active. And then she said the words that literally stopped my heart from beating in my chest. She said, "Maya will not survive the hiking trip in the Swiss Alps. It is a tragic accident waiting to happen, and you will be the grieving widow holding all the cards." Preston chuckled again, a sickening, terrifying sound. He agreed, saying it was a brilliant plan. The air in my lungs turned to heavy ash. My legs felt like they were going to instantly give out beneath me. My mind raced back to the honeymoon plans. Preston had forcefully insisted on booking a remote high-altitude hiking excursion in Switzerland, claiming it would be a romantic adventure. My beautiful Maya, who hated the cold and had zero mountain climbing experience, had reluctantly agreed just to make him happy. He was planning to push her off a mountain, and he needed me to blindly sign over my legal rights, so I could not intervene when she was brought into a foreign hospital on life support. They stayed in the shop for another 5 grueling minutes, calmly discussing the quickest way to liquidate my commercial real estate portfolio once they had complete control of my daughter's estate. Every single word they casually spoke was a heavy sledgehammer striking the foundation of my entire life. I did not move an inch. I did not breathe. I let the total darkness of that fitting room swallow my initial shock and carefully turn it into pure, unadulterated rage. I heard the shop door chime as they finally walked out into the daylight. Dominic immediately unlocked my door. He was sweating profusely, looking at me with absolute pity and terror. I did not say a word to him. I just reached out, gripped his shoulder in silent gratitude, and walked straight out the front door. I climbed into my heavy truck, gripping the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned entirely white. I slammed my heavy boot on the gas pedal. I did not call the police. I did not have any recorded proof, only my word against theirs, and I knew Maya was completely under his manipulative spell. I sped straight through the Dallas traffic toward my daughter's apartment building. The rage burning in my chest was a living, breathing thing. I was going to kick her front door off its hinges. I was going to tear Preston apart piece by piece until he confessed everything. To any parent listening, never let the fear of pushing your children away stop you from trusting your ultimate gut feeling. Predators do not come with warning labels. They come disguised as everything your child has ever wanted. They use charm as a weapon and isolation as a daily tool. If someone enters your family and suddenly the dynamics turn completely toxic, if your child changes or starts pushing you away, do not politely step aside. Investigate. Ask the hard questions. Gather your evidence in the dark. It is always better to be a villain in their eyes for a single month than to mourn them for the rest of your life. If this story proved that a father's love is the ultimate shield, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of survival and absolute justice. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? See you in the next video. I parked my truck by the curb, ignoring the fire lane. My boots pounded against the concrete floor of the lobby as I ignored the concierge. I marched into the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. My chest was heaving. The doors slid open, and I did not even bother to knock. I shoved the oak door so hard it slammed against the wall with a deafening crack. Maya gasped and dropped a stack of wedding invitations on the hardwood floor. Preston was sitting on the modern leather sofa, sipping a glass of sparkling water. He did not flinch. He did not jump. He just looked at me with those cold, empty eyes. They were the eyes of a predator calmly analyzing its prey. I crossed the living room in 3 massive strides. I pointed my finger directly at his face and told him I knew exactly what he was planning. I demanded to know about the medical power of attorney. I demanded to know about the $10 million life insurance policy and the sudden hiking trip in the Swiss Alps. I turned to Maya and begged her to get away from him, pleading that he and his supposed sister Valerie were planning to kill her. I was ready for him to break down, stutter, or try to physically fight me right there in the living room. Instead, Preston did the most terrifying thing imaginable. He simply sighed, placed his glass on the coffee table, and looked at Maya with an expression of deep wounded sympathy. He slowly stood up, holding his hands open in a gesture of complete surrender. He spoke with a voice so smooth and perfectly calibrated, it made me sick. He calmly stated that he understood why I was confused, completely ignoring my raging anger. He walked over to his leather briefcase on the counter and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He laid them out on the kitchen island, smoothing the crisp pages with his manicured hands. He turned to Maya, gently touching her arm to reassure her, and then he looked directly at me. He patiently explained that the trust fund paperwork was standard procedure for high-net-worth families entering a marriage. He said that with my commercial real estate portfolio in Dallas, Maya was facing a massive tax burden. He spoke about the 40% United States estate tax, throwing around complex financial jargon with the exact precision of a seasoned corporate attorney. He claimed the medical power of attorney was just a standard, routine rider that the lawyers automatically attached to ensure Maya was protected if anything ever happened to me, not the other way around. He twisted the narrative so flawlessly that for a split second even I questioned my own sanity. Then I brought up the $10 million life insurance policy. I yelled that it was a motive for premeditated murder. Preston still did not raise his voice. He reached into the briefcase again and pulled out a bank letter. He explained, looking at Maya with absolute devotion, that the life insurance was a mandatory requirement from the private bank to secure the mortgage on the new Beverly Hills mansion he was buying for their future together. He said it was a financial safety net to ensure Maya would never be burdened with crippling debt if he passed away unexpectedly. He made it sound incredibly romantic. He made it sound like the ultimate act of a providing husband. As for the Swiss Alps, he smiled softly and reminded Maya that it was supposed to be a surprise. He explained it was a highly supervised guided luxury tour with professional Sherpas, not some dangerous solo mountain climb. He played the victim with chilling perfection. He looked at me with sorrowful eyes and quietly asked why I hated him so deeply that I would invent a murder plot just days before the happiest moment of their lives. I turned to my daughter, desperately expecting her to see through on his smooth lies. I begged her to listen to me, trying to tell her about Dominic the tailor shop and the terrifying conversation I had just heard in the fitting room. But when I looked into Maya's eyes, I did not see the little girl I had raised and protected. I saw a complete stranger consumed by a carefully constructed illusion. Her face was flushed with intense anger. Her hands were trembling, but she was entirely furious with me. She stepped squarely in front of Preston, shielding him from my anger. She told me I had completely lost my mind. Her voice cracked as she brought up her mother. She said that ever since Martha died 7 years ago, I had become paranoid, suffocating, and controlling. She accused me of trying to ruin her happiness because I was terrified of being alone in my old age. Every single word she spoke was a dagger precisely aimed at my deepest emotional vulnerabilities. I tried to speak, to explain the coldness in Valerie's voice, the sheer malice I had heard through that wooden wall. But Maya forcefully held up her hand, refusing to listen to another word. She said I had spent my entire life building cold, lifeless steel structures, and now I was trying to tear down the only beautiful thing she had ever built for herself. She cried bitterly, saying Preston had done nothing but support her and love her unconditionally, while I was acting like a crazy old man trying to sabotage her future. The betrayal in her eyes was devastating. She pointed a shaking finger toward the open doorway of the penthouse. She screamed that I was ruining her life and destroying her wedding. She told me to leave and not come back until I was ready to apologize and accept the man she loved. I stood there looking at the two of them. Preston wrapped his arms around her shoulders, kissing her head while she sobbed into his chest. Over her shaking shoulder, he looked right at me. A slow, chilling smirk crept across his face. It was the undeniable smirk of a man who knew he had won the first battle. I realized in that exact moment that fighting him in the open would only push Maya further into his deadly trap. If I kept pushing, she would cut me off completely, and she would die in those freezing mountains. I turned and slowly walked out of the apartment, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. I stood completely alone in the quiet carpeted hallway. I was cut off from my only child. I had absolutely no evidence to take to the police. I had no allies left in her life. But I knew the absolute terrifying truth. If Preston wanted to play a game of shadows to steal my legacy and harm my daughter, he was about to learn exactly how ruthless a loving father could be. I walked toward the elevator, formulating a new plan. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire existence piece by piece until he had absolutely nothing left in this world to hide behind anymore. I spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, forcing my bruised ego to submit to cold logic. An engineer knows if you attack a fortified wall head-on, you only break your own tools. You must find the stress points. To do that, you need access. The next morning, I picked up my phone and did the hardest thing I have ever done. I called my daughter and lied. I let my voice shake. I forced a pathetic, trembling tone that made me sound incredibly old. I apologized profusely for my outburst. I blamed my behavior on the grief of losing her mother, claiming the thought of giving her away triggered a panic attack. I swallowed my pride and begged for her forgiveness. Maya hesitated, her voice laced with suspicion, but her heart is inherently good. She sighed, her tone softening, and invited me to join them for Sunday brunch at the country club to clear the air. She said Preston encouraged her to give me another chance. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and felt an icy resolve settle into my bones. Sunday morning arrived with a blinding sun. I walked onto the patio of the country club, wearing a tailored suit and a perfectly constructed mask of contrition. Maya, Preston, and Valerie were seated at a table overlooking the 18th hole. I approached them with an apologetic smile, playing the role of the chastened elder statesman who realized his place. Preston stood up to greet me, his expression radiating a smug, magnanimous victory. He played the gracious winner flawlessly, pulling out my chair and ordering me a coffee. Valerie sat across from him, sipping a mimosa, her eyes tracking my movement with calculating precision. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and completely shifted my mindset. I stopped talking and started observing. I shut off the emotional part of my brain, the part that screamed to grab Preston by the throat, and engaged the analytical mind of an engineer. I began to look for the hairline fractures in their facade. Preston dominated this conversation. He spoke at length about his wealthy upbringing in Boston, name-dropping elite boarding schools and exclusive yacht clubs with practiced ease. He rested his left arm on the white tablecloth, prominently displaying a gold vintage Rolex. He caught me looking at it and proudly stated it was a family heirloom passed down from his grandfather, a titan of industry. It was a beautiful timepiece from a distance, but my eyes are trained to catch millimeter discrepancies in steel beams from 50 yards away. As he reached for his water glass, the sunlight caught the watch face perfectly. I watched the second hand. In a genuine vintage mechanical Rolex, the second hand sweeps in a continuous fluid motion, but Preston's watch did not sweep. It ticked. One rigid, distinct jump per second. It was a quartz movement. The watch was an incredibly cheap mass-produced fake wrapped in a shiny gold casing. It was a counterfeit, just like the man wearing it. A small crack in the foundation had just revealed itself. My mind raced, filing the detail away, as I casually nodded along to his fabricated family history. A few minutes later, the waiter brought our plates. In the process of adjusting my silverware, I deliberately knocked my cloth napkin off my lap. It fluttered to the stone floor. I leaned down to pick it up, glancing under the table for a fraction of a second. What I saw made my blood run cold. Valerie, the woman introduced to the world as his older sister, had her high-heeled shoe slipped off. Her bare foot was resting high on Preston's inner thigh, her toes slowly and intimately stroking his leg. It was a deeply familiar sexual gesture that no sister would ever perform. They were relaxed, entirely confident in their deception, believing the foolish old man across the table was blind to their game. I sat back up, keeping my face blank, my heart thumping a dangerous rhythm against my ribs. I turned my attention to Maya. Throughout the entire brunch, my vibrant, energetic daughter had barely spoken 3 sentences. She sat slumped in her chair, her posture completely defeated. Her normally radiant skin was pale and ashen, possessing a sickly, almost translucent quality. She stared at her untouched food with vacant, unfocused eyes. When the waiter asked if she wanted a refill, she blinked several times, seemingly struggling to process the simple question. Preston immediately intervened, placing a gentle, controlling hand over hers, smoothly answering for her. He claimed she was just exhausted from the wedding planning and needed rest. Maya simply nodded a slow, robotic movement and leaned her heavy head against his shoulder. The horrifying realization hit me like a freight train. She was not just tired, she was deeply lethargic, stripped of her natural agency. The conversation I heard in the fitting room echoed violently in my mind. They were systematically drugging her. They were keeping her in a compliant chemical haze to prevent her from noticing the red flags, ensuring she would blindly sign any document they put in front of her. Every protective instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up, flip the table, and drag my daughter out of that club right then and there. I wanted to scream for the police to demand a blood test to expose them to the entire dining room. But my engineering mind clamped down hard on my emotions, stopping me before I could make a fatal error. If I called the police right now, what would actually happen? I had no physical proof. I had a counterfeit watch and a fleeting glance under a table. Maya, under the heavy influence of whatever toxins they were feeding her, would undoubtedly defend Preston. The police would see a dramatic family dispute, a father making wild accusations against a loving fiancé. They would leave, and Preston would immediately realize the depth of my suspicion. He would accelerate his timeline. He would take Maya far away, completely sever my access, and execute his murderous plan where I could never reach them. I realized acting on impulse would sign my daughter's death warrant. I could not rely on gut feelings or circumstantial observations. I needed hard, irrefutable facts. I needed bank records, toxicological reports, and a documented trail of deception that no lawyer, police officer, or judge could ever ignore. I needed destructive evidence. I spent the remainder of the brunch playing my assigned role to perfection. I smiled, laughed at Preston's fake jokes, and kissed Maya's pale cheek when we parted ways in the parking lot. I watched Preston guide her into his sports car, a fake prince leading a captive princess into a meticulously designed trap. I waved goodbye, keeping the gentle, apologetic smile plastered on my face until their car disappeared around the bend of the driveway. The moment they were out of sight, the smile vanished. I walked back to my truck, my mind already calculating the complex geometry of their destruction. The game of shadows had begun, and I was going to tear their world apart. The very next morning, I drove to the main branch of my bank in downtown Dallas. I wore a plain jacket and a baseball cap, keeping my head down as I bypassed the main teller lines. I went straight to the private wealth management offices and sat across from my personal banker. I told him I needed exactly $100,000 in untraceable cash. He looked at me with deep concern, gently asking if I was in trouble. I forced a tired smile and told him I was making a highly confidential investment in a private venture. He did not push the issue. An hour later, I walked out of that bank with a heavy leather duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the weight of the bundled bills pressing against my side. From the bank, I drove to a nondescript office building on the industrial edge of the city. I was not looking for a standard private detective who snaps photos of cheating spouses. I needed a ghost. I needed someone who operated entirely in the shadows, someone who understood the intricate mechanics of financial fraud. I made careful phone calls to old contacts and commercial construction men who dealt with corporate espionage, and every single one gave me the exact same name: Victor Thorne. Victor was a former federal financial investigator forced out of the agency a decade ago for his utterly ruthless methods. He did not care about legal red tape. He cared about results. I walked into his sparsely furnished office and dropped the heavy leather duffel bag directly onto his metal desk. I unzipped the top, revealing the stacks of $100 bills. Victor barely blinked. He leaned back in his creaking chair and asked me who we were destroying today. I told him everything. I detailed the conversation in the tailor shop, the fake watch, the suspicious legal documents, and the terrifying physical state of my daughter. Victor listened in absolute, calculated silence. When I finished, he simply nodded, pulled a clean notepad from his drawer, and told me we were going to trace every single breath this man had ever taken. Before Victor and I could make a move, I needed to create a massive diversion. I needed Preston to feel completely victorious and entirely safe. I drove back to my house, packed a large golf bag, and deliberately called Maya while I was putting my clubs in the trunk. I made sure my voice sounded thoroughly defeated, playing the role of the broken father who had finally accepted defeat. I told her our terrible argument had shaken me to my core, and I was letting my grief over her mother ruin the most important week of her life. I said I was flying down to a secluded golf resort in Florida to cool off, clear my head, and prepare myself to walk her down the aisle with a genuine smile. Preston was in the background. I could hear him urging Maya to put me on speakerphone. He chimed in, his voice dripping with fake, sugary concern. He told me it was a fantastic idea, assuring me that Florida would be exactly what I needed to relax. He promised he would take perfect care of Maya while I was gone, telling me to focus on my golf swing and let them handle the remaining wedding stress. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I thanked him, told Maya I loved her more than life itself, and ended the call. Preston thought he had successfully banished the annoying old man to a golf course 1,000 miles away. He was fatally mistaken. I did not fly to Florida. I drove to a private airfield on the outskirts of Dallas, where Victor had already chartered a small, untraceable jet using a corporate shell account. We boarded the plane in complete silence, bringing nothing but 2 small overnight bags and a pair of heavy laptops. As the jet climbed into the sky, banking sharply toward the East Coast, Victor laid out the wedding invitations Preston had so proudly designed. The heavy cream-colored cardstock featured a beautiful crest and an elegant return address for his family. Preston had relentlessly bragged about his generational wealth, claiming his family owned a massive historic estate in one of the most exclusive old money neighborhoods in Boston. He spun elaborate tales during dinner parties about growing up in a sprawling stone mansion with manicured gardens and luxury cars. He said his parents were touring Europe and would fly directly into Dallas just in time for the rehearsal dinner. It was a perfectly constructed narrative designed to make my daughter feel like she was marrying royalty. But as Victor typed furiously on his laptop, tapping into restricted databases using backdoors, the federal government thought they had closed years ago, the cracks began to multiply. Victor pulled up property tax records, municipal utility bills, and zoning permits. The Boston address on the wedding invitations did not belong to the Cole family. There was absolutely no record of a wealthy Cole family existing anywhere in that prestigious zip code for the last 50 years. We landed in Boston under a heavy overcast sky. The air was bitterly cold, biting through my thin jacket, but I barely felt it. We rented a nondescript sedan and drove straight into the heart of the city. I navigated the narrow, winding streets, clutching the steering wheel as the GPS guided us closer and closer to the address printed on the elegant wedding invitations. My heart pounded a relentless rhythm against my ribs. We turned off the main affluent boulevard and drove down a declining industrial side street. The grand historic mansions with sprawling lawns quickly gave way to cracked sidewalks and tall chain-link fences. I pulled the sedan to a slow, creeping halt at the exact coordinates Preston had given the entire world. I put the car in park and stared out the windshield in absolute horrifying disbelief. There was no historic stone mansion. There were no manicured gardens or grand libraries. The address belonged to a dilapidated, abandoned strip mall. The windows were boarded up with rotting plywood covered in peeling graffiti and faded gang signs. The parking lot was a sea of cracked, weed-choked asphalt littered with broken glass and rusted shopping carts. The specific unit number listed as his family estate was nothing but a tiny, ruined storefront that used to be a discount liquor shop, its faded awning sagging dangerously toward the very ground beneath it. Victor sat quietly in the passenger seat, his dark eyes locked on the completely desolate scene before us. He slowly closed his heavy laptop and turned to look directly at me. The silence in the small car was thick and heavy, suffocating me with the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the entire deception. Preston was not a wealthy tech investor from an old money family. The man currently sleeping next to my heavily drugged daughter, the man systematically preparing to take full control of her entire life, did not actually exist. The upcoming wedding was a complete lie, and Preston was an absolute terrifying ghost. Victor did not waste a single second staring at the ruined building. He flipped his heavy laptop open again, the pale light of the screen casting long shadows across his focused face. His fingers flew across the keyboard with a practiced, terrifying speed. He bypassed the standard public directories and tapped directly into the municipal tax registries and property ownership archives. He linked the address of the abandoned discount liquor store to a network of obscure shell companies. The layers of deception were incredibly dense, meticulously designed to frustrate any standard background check. But Victor was not a standard investigator. He was a predator who hunted financial criminals for a living. I sat completely still in the driver's seat, silently listening to the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his keys, my eyes firmly locked on the rotting plywood covering the ruined storefront. The damp, freezing Boston air seeped through the windows, but a hot, suffocating anger was radiating from my chest. Victor broke the silence, his voice a low, steady hum. He explained that the shell company registered to this address was a dead end on paper, but every shell company has a registered agent and a bank routing number seems to pay the minimum state filing fees. He ran that routing number through a specialized financial database tracing the origin of the funds. The screen began to populate with a dizzying cascade of banking records, wire transfers, and offshore accounts. It was an intricate web of stolen money being funneled through dummy corporations. Victor pointed to a specific series of transactions. He showed me how the money was being systematically washed and redirected to a high-yield checking account in Dallas, Texas. That single account was the lifeblood of his fabricated existence. It paid for the European sports car. It paid for the tailored suits. It funded the extravagant dinners at five-star restaurants and the illusion of a wildly successful tech investor. Every single dime of his glamorous lifestyle was violently extracted from the accounts of unknown victims and funneled through this decaying strip mall. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the digital numbers representing millions of stolen dollars slide across the dark monitor. A sickening wave of disgust washed over me. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the car window and closed my eyes. My mind instantly drifted back to the sweltering, unforgiving heat of the Texas summers. I thought about the 40 years I spent building my commercial real estate portfolio. I did not inherit a single penny. I started as a junior structural engineer wearing steel-toed boots and a hard hat, walking construction sites when the concrete was still wet and the temperature pushed past 100 degrees. I voluntarily worked grueling 80-hour weeks, missing countless family dinners, school recitals, and weekend baseball games, simply because I was absolutely determined to build an unbreakable foundation for my wife and my daughter. I remembered the physical toll it took on my body, the permanent ache in my lower back, the calluses on my hands, that never completely faded the countless nights I spent awake at the kitchen table agonizing over blueprints and supply chain budgets. I poured my literal sweat and blood into the soil of Dallas to create a legacy of security and respect. I built skyscrapers that reached toward the clouds, structures designed to withstand the brutal forces of nature. And I did it all so Maya would never have to know the crushing weight of poverty or the desperate fear of instability. And now, sitting in this freezing rental car, I was forced to look at the exact opposite of everything I stood for. He was a parasite. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man who produced absolutely nothing of value. He did not build. He did not create. He simply identified innocent people who had worked hard their entire lives, people who were exceptionally trusting and highly vulnerable, and he systematically drained their financial accounts completely dry. He was trying to hijack my 40 years of relentless sacrifice overnight. He wanted to take the empire I built for my daughter and use it to fund his pathetic criminal vanity. The sheer audacity of his parasitic existence made my blood boil with a lethal intensity. I opened my eyes, the sadness completely burning away, leaving nothing but a hardened, calculated resolve. I was not going to expose him. I was going to utterly dismantle him. Victor let out a sharp, sudden breath. The rapid clicking of his keyboard abruptly stopped. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he read a newly decrypted file. The ambient light from the screen illuminated a sudden shift in his expression. The usual detached professionalism of the ex-federal investigator was replaced by genuine, unadulterated shock. He slowly shook his head, muttering under his breath that this guy was incredibly sloppy for someone playing such a high-stakes game. I demanded to know what he had found. I leaned over the center console, my eyes scanning the complex blocks of text on his screen. Victor pulled up a digitized police record from a precinct in Nevada dating back over a decade. He explained that by cross-referencing the origin accounts with old arrest warrants for wire fraud, he had finally managed to bypass the fake identity. Preston Cole did not exist. It was an alias created 4 years ago. His real name was Thomas Vance. He was actually a convicted con artist who had previously served 3 hard years in a medium-security state penitentiary for ruthlessly orchestrating a massive real estate scam that specifically targeted vulnerable elderly widows. He had a documented history of financial predation. My chest tightened. The man sleeping next to my daughter was a convicted felon. But Victor was not finished. His fingers began to move across the keyboard again, even faster this time. He opened a separate browser window and accessed a deeply restricted public records database. He typed the real name Thomas Vance alongside the name Valerie Cross, referencing their past residential addresses and known associates. A progress bar loaded on the screen, dragging out the agonizing tension in the small, silent car. Suddenly, a high-resolution scanned document appeared on the monitor. It was an official state record complete with a raised seal and a series of distinct signatures. Victor downloaded the file and opened it to full screen. He stared at it for a long, heavy moment. He slowly closed his eyes, let out a deep, heavy sigh, and then he violently slammed his silver laptop shut. The sudden sharp noise echoed like a gunshot in the confined space of the vehicle. He turned his head and looked me directly in the eyes. His voice was completely devoid of any emotion, cold and absolute. He told me to brace myself. He gently placed his right hand flat on the closed laptop and quietly whispered the exact words that would officially begin the total, irreversible destruction of my beloved daughter's carefully fabricated reality. "Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly pitch, "they are not brother and sister." I stared at Victor, the damp chill of the Boston evening vanishing, replaced by a freezing numbness in my chest. I asked him to repeat what he had just said. Victor did not repeat himself. Instead, he tapped the screen of his laptop, enlarging the scanned document until the text filled the monitor. I leaned across the center console, scanning the heavily watermarked paper. It was a marriage certificate issued in Clark County, Nevada. The date stamped at the top showed it had been filed exactly 8 years ago. My eyes tracked down to the signatures at the bottom. The first signature belonged to Thomas Vance, the convicted felon I knew as Preston Cole. The second signature belonged to Valerie Vance, the woman currently staying in my daughter's guest room, eating our food and posing as his loving, supportive older sister. They were not siblings. They were legally bound husband and wife. The sheer depravity of their deception washed over me like a physical blow. My mind flashed back to the country club brunch, to the horrifying image of Valerie rubbing her bare foot against Preston's thigh under the white tablecloth, while my beautiful drugged daughter sat across from them. Victor kept his voice low and steady, analyzing the situation with the detached precision of a seasoned investigator. He explained we were looking at a highly organized, deeply experienced grifter team. He pulled up a secondary file outlining a pattern of behavior that made my blood run cold. This was their modus operandi. They systematically hunted for wealthy, emotionally vulnerable women. They targeted women who were isolated or grieving women who were desperate for love and validation. Preston would assume a meticulously crafted fake identity, playing the role of the perfect, charming suitor. He would sweep the victim off her feet with lavish attention and fabricated wealth. Meanwhile, Valerie would insert herself into the dynamic as the protective but welcoming sister, providing a false sense of family and stability to complete the intricate illusion. Once the trap was set and the victim was fully isolated from her real family and friends, they would strike with absolutely zero mercy or hesitation. But this time, Victor noted his eyes dark and serious. The stakes were infinitely higher. Maya was not just a wealthy mark with a healthy savings account. Maya was the sole heir to a commercial real estate empire I had spent 4 decades building from the dirt up. And more importantly, she was about to be tied to a newly minted $10 million life insurance policy. They were not just planning to steal her money, take my properties, and run. They were planning to steal my entire legacy and then execute my only child in the freezing mountains of Switzerland to cash out the ultimate prize. I sat back against the stiff fabric of the passenger seat, struggling to pull oxygen into my burning lungs. I had spent my entire life calculating load-bearing walls, assessing stress points, and reinforcing foundations with solid steel. I knew how to protect structures from hurricanes and earthquakes, but nothing had prepared me for the structural collapse of my own family. The monsters were already inside the house. They were sleeping under my daughter's roof, slowly poisoning her mind and body with whatever toxic cocktail they were slipping into her daily routine. I closed my eyes, fighting back a sudden, overwhelming surge of tears. I could not cry. I could not afford the luxury of grief or panic. Maya needed an engineer right now. She needed a father who could build a trap so devastating and airtight that these parasites would never see the light of day again. Victor broke into my thoughts, asking how we should proceed. He suggested we take this newly discovered marriage certificate straight to the local authorities, hoping they could arrest Preston on outstanding warrants or parole violations under his real name. I shook my head, my jaw set with absolute unshakable determination. I told Victor an arrest for an old wire fraud charge would only put Thomas Vance away for a few short months. Valerie would post his bail and they would disappear into the wind, forever vanishing before I could secure Maya's safety. I needed them to face justice for attempted murder. I needed to expose their active conspiracy in a way that left zero room for legal maneuvering or lenient plea deals. I told Victor we were sticking to the original plan. We had to let them walk directly into the snare at the rehearsal dinner. As I finished speaking, the sudden vibration of my cell phone startled both of us. It buzzed loudly in the cup holder between our seats. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly as I looked at the brightly illuminated screen. It was a text message from Maya. Seeing her name brought a painful lump to my throat. I quickly unlocked the phone and opened the message, expecting a brief update or maybe another defensive argument about our terrible fight. Instead, the words I read made the blood freeze in my veins all over again. Maya had written, "Preston says my vitamins are making me dizzy, so we are moving the Swiss Alps trip up by 2 days. We leave right after the reception. I read the text a second time, and then a third, my eyes burning into the glowing white letters. Preston was accelerating the timeline. He knew the heavy sedatives and beta blockers he was feeding her were taking a visible toll. He knew she was becoming dangerously weak, perhaps too weak to stand through a long wedding reception. Or maybe he had sensed my sudden shift in demeanor during the brunch and realized his window of absolute safety was rapidly closing. Whatever his reasoning, he had panicked. He was manipulating her into leaving the country immediately after the reception, completely bypassing the 2-day grace period we had originally planned around. He was removing her from American soil, away from my protection, away from American law enforcement, faster than I had anticipated. I handed the phone to Victor. He read the short message in silence, his jaw tightening. He looked at me, confirming the terrifying reality of our new situation. The window for our counterattack had just violently slammed shut by 48 hours. We lacked the time to prepare our evidence with the authorities. We were now operating on an incredibly dangerous, highly compressed schedule. The rehearsal dinner was no longer just the final piece of the trap. It was the absolute deadline. If I did not stop them there, if I failed to execute the plan perfectly, Maya would be on a private jet to Europe by midnight, and I would never see my daughter alive again. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold Boston air filling my lungs. I turned the key, and the heavy engine roared. I shifted the heavy rental car into drive. I had less than 72 hours to save her life. The countdown echoed in my mind. There was absolutely no time to process the sickening reality of the marriage certificate or the depth of their deception. I looked at Victor in the cold rental car and told him we needed to be back in Texas before sundown. We abandoned the Boston Strip Mall and drove back to the private airfield. The flight to Dallas was agonizingly silent. I visualized the layout of the penthouse I paid for, calculating blind spots, preparing myself. I was no longer just an angry father attempting to protect his daughter. I was an engineer dismantling a hostile structure from the inside out. As soon as the wheels touched the tarmac in Texas, Victor opened his laptop and accessed the cellular tracking software he used to locate financial fugitives. Within minutes, he confirmed that Preston and Maya were across town at a bakery for a final cake tasting. Valerie was registered at a bridal boutique, picking up last-minute alterations. The penthouse was completely empty, but the window of opportunity was terrifyingly narrow. I left Victor parked 2 blocks away from the luxury high-rise and walked toward the building with my head down. I bypassed the main lobby entirely, utilizing the underground service entrance I remembered from the original construction blueprints. I slipped into the freight elevator and rode it up to the penthouse level, my pulse pounding a steady rhythmic drum against my ribs. When the heavy metal doors slid open, I stepped out into the quiet carpeted hallway. I stood before the massive oak door of their apartment. Preston had bragged about installing a military-grade smart lock system. To a structural engineer who spent decades designing commercial security access points, it was simply a puzzle waiting to be solved. I knelt down and examined the digital keypad and the underlying mechanical tumbler. I pulled a small tension wrench and a bypass probe from my pocket. I inserted the probe into the tiny maintenance gap beneath the housing, feeling for the magnetic catch. With a slow, deliberate twist of my wrist, I disrupted the current just long enough to disengage the deadbolt. The heavy door clicked open with a soft, yielding sigh. I stepped inside, closing the door silently behind me. The apartment smelled of expensive vanilla candles and impending doom. I did not waste a single second looking at the wedding gifts piled in the living room. I moved with silent, purposeful strides directly toward the master suite, seeking the room Preston had claimed as his private home office. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The space was meticulously organized, projecting the false image of a highly successful executive. I began my search systematically. I checked the drawers, the filing cabinets, and the false bottoms of the desk, finding nothing. Preston was a convicted con artist. He would never leave his most dangerous secrets sitting in a standard drawer. He needed a secure, hidden anchor. I stepped back and evaluated the room through the eyes of a builder. I calculated the square footage, comparing the interior dimensions of the office to the hallway outside. There was a discrepancy. The wall behind his mahogany desk was nearly 8 inches thicker than the architectural standard. I moved around the desk and ran my hands over the smooth drywall. I tapped my knuckles against the surface. About 3 feet from the floor, the sound shifted from a hollow echo to a dull, dense thud. I felt along the baseboard and found a nearly invisible seam. I pressed my fingers firmly against the edge of the panel, and a small section of the wall popped open on a hidden spring hinge. Behind the panel sat a heavy fireproof steel safe. It was a mechanical combination dial, not a digital keypad. My breathing grew shallow as I knelt in front of it. Cracking a mechanical safe requires absolute silence and a deep understanding of friction mechanics. I pressed my ear directly against the cold steel door, closing my eyes to isolate my hearing. I grasped the dial and began to turn it with agonizing slowness. I listened for the microscopic metallic clicks of the internal tumblers falling into place. It was a game of tactile feedback, feeling the slight drag of the locking mechanism as it engaged the pins. The first number hit with a heavy click. I reversed the rotation, feeling the precise moment the second pin caught. I turned the dial one final time to the right. The third click echoed loudly in my own ears. I pulled the heavy handle downward, and the steel door swung open, revealing the dark interior. I reached inside the safe and pulled out a small black plastic tray. Resting in the center of the tray was a cheap, disposable burner phone. But the object sitting right next to the phone was what made my blood freeze solid. It was a standard amber prescription bottle stripped of any pharmacy labeling. Instead, a piece of white masking tape was wrapped around the plastic. The label simply read, "Maya's Supplements." I unscrewed the child-proof cap with trembling fingers. Inside the bottle was a collection of heavy, unmarked blue capsules. These were not vitamins. These were the chemical chains binding my daughter to her executioner. I quickly tipped the bottle over, stealing exactly 2 of the blue pills and slipping them deep into my breast pocket for toxicological testing. I screwed the cap back on and placed the bottle exactly where I had found it. A sharp sound shattered the absolute silence of the apartment. The private elevator chimed through the penthouse. Panic flared hot in my chest. They were back early. I shoved the plastic tray back into the safe, slammed the heavy steel door shut, and kicked the hidden wall panel back into place. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering violently against my sternum. I could hear the front door unlocking. I heard Preston's smooth voice echoing in the entryway. I lunged out of the office and sprinted silently down the short hallway, slipping into the emergency fire stairwell, just a fraction of a second before Preston turned the corner into the living area. I pulled the heavy fire door shut behind me, leaving it cracked open less than half an inch. I stood perfectly still, pressing my back against the wall. I could hear Preston moving through the apartment. He walked directly into his office. I heard the unmistakable sound of the hidden wall panel popping open, followed by the rapid turning of the safe dial. A moment later, I heard the distinct electronic tone of a phone powering on. It was the burner phone. I pressed my ear closer to the crack in the door, straining to catch every single syllable. Preston spoke in a hushed, strictly business tone. I heard him confirm that the cake tasting was successful and that Maya was resting. Then he delivered the words that confirmed my absolute worst nightmare. He spoke with chilling clinical detachment. He said the dosage is perfect. Her heart rate is dropping. It will look exactly like natural altitude sickness in the Alps. The heavy steel fire door felt like a block of ice against my spine. I held my breath, listening to the muffled sounds of his footsteps moving away. I waited until I heard the faint rustle of the living room rug, signaling he had walked back to the main area of the penthouse. I slipped out of the emergency stairwell, taking the maintenance elevator down to the basement parking garage. My mind was racing with terrifying clarity. I burst through the exit doors and walked rapidly toward the rental car, where Victor was waiting. I climbed into the passenger seat, pulled the stolen blue capsules from my pocket, and dropped them onto the center console. I told Victor exactly what I had heard through the crack in the door. I repeated Preston's chilling words about altitude sickness and the perfect dosage. Victor did not show a single ounce of surprise. He put the car in drive, his face a mask of hardened concentration, and told me we were going to a private laboratory he trusted on the north side of the city. We needed absolute confirmation before making our next move. The drive across the city felt like a waking nightmare. Every red light was an agonizing delay, a precious second stolen from my daughter's expiring timeline. We pulled up to a nondescript concrete building, nestled in a quiet commercial park. The sign on the glass door read, "Advanced Analytical Solutions." Victor bypassed the reception desk entirely, leading me down a sterile, brightly lit corridor toward the rear testing facilities. He pushed open a swinging door and introduced me to Dr. Aris Thorne, an independent forensic toxicologist who owed Victor a professional favor. Aris was a quiet man with tired eyes and a clean white coat. He did not ask unnecessary questions about where the unmarked pills came from or why a former investigator was bringing them through his back door. He simply took the capsules, placed them into a sterilized tray, and told us the mass spectrometry analysis would take exactly 3 hours. He pointed us to a small, windowless waiting room down the hall. Those 3 hours were the longest of my life. I paced the small room, the rhythmic sound of my boots measuring out the agonizing passage of time. I thought about Maya, her pale skin, and her empty eyes. Finally, the heavy door clicked open. Dr. Thorne walked into the room holding a thick stack of printed analytical reports. His expression was grim, the look a doctor gives right before delivering a terminal diagnosis. He handed the top sheet to Victor, but looked directly at me. He stated that the blue capsules were not nutritional supplements, vitamins, or benign herbal remedies. They were a highly concentrated, lethal pharmaceutical cocktail. He explained the chemical breakdown with terrifying precision. The primary ingredient was a massive dose of a powerful prescription beta blocker designed to artificially suppress the human heart rate and lower blood pressure to dangerously low levels. The secondary compound was a heavy, fast-acting hypnotic sedative. Dr. Thorne set the paperwork on the table and explained the deadly synergy of the combination. If a healthy person took these pills at sea level, they would experience extreme fatigue, lethargy, and a severe drop in blood pressure. It would mimic deep viral exhaustion. But if that same person took this precise cocktail while rapidly ascending to a massive altitude like the peaks of the Swiss Alps, the physiological results would be catastrophic. The thin mountain air would force the heart to pump faster to survive. The beta blockers would forcefully prevent the heart from speeding up. The resulting cardiovascular conflict would cause a massive, instantaneous cardiac arrest. It was a flawlessly designed, untraceable method of execution. It would look exactly like a tragic natural medical failure caused by severe altitude sickness. The toxicologist's words hit me with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. The room began to spin. A primal rage exploded in my chest, shattering the cold, analytical control I had maintained. It was premeditated murder. Preston and Valerie were actively managing my daughter's chemical decline, preparing her body for a lonely death on a freezing mountain, all to collect a $10 million payout and inherit my life's work. I let out a guttural scream, a sound foreign to my own ears. I grabbed the edge of the metal table, my knuckles turning bone white, and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the dry wall with a deafening crash. I turned toward the exit, my vision swimming in a sea of red. I did not care about plans, evidence, or the authorities anymore. I was going to drive straight back to the penthouse, kick the oak door off its hinges, and tear Preston apart with my bare hands. I was going to choke the life out of him. I reached the door handle, muscles coiled with violent intent. Before I could turn the knob, Victor moved with terrifying speed. He slammed his body against the door, blocking my exit. I grabbed his shirt to throw him aside, but he did not flinch. He grabbed my shoulders and shoved me hard against the wall, pinning me in place with incredible strength. He stared into my furious eyes. His voice was a harsh bark, cutting through the noise of my panic. He told me to stop acting like a reckless fool. He stated that if I walked into that penthouse and killed Preston today, I would spend the rest of my life rotting in prison. Worse, Valerie would vanish into the shadows, claim the hidden assets, and evade justice entirely. Maya would be left alone, traumatized and vulnerable to the remaining members of their criminal network. Victor's grip tightened. He lowered his voice, his tone shifting to a cold, razor-sharp promise. He said we had to destroy them legally, systematically, and publicly. We had to trap them in a cage constructed of their own arrogance, exposing their monstrous deception in front of everyone they manipulated. Only then would Maya truly be safe. I released my grip on his shirt. The red rage receded, replaced by a dark ocean of calculated hatred. I nodded, breathing heavy, agreeing to his terms. I smoothed my jacket, forcing the engineer back to the surface. Victor stepped away, adjusting his collar, satisfied the crisis was averted. He opened his laptop. He told me that while the toxicologist ran the analysis, He ran a deep algorithmic background check on Thomas Vance's history. He targeted unresolved police reports, suspicious accidental deaths, and massive life insurance payouts connected to aliases used over the last 10 years. He said the marriage certificate in Boston was just the beginning. He uncovered a horrifying pattern of systemic fatal predation. Victor turned the laptop so the screen faced me directly. He pulled up a scanned newspaper clipping from a Florida publication dated exactly 2 years ago. The headline announced the sudden passing of a wealthy heiress during a private yachting trip. He slammed his hand flat on the table, pointing a finger directly at the grainy photograph of the grieving widower featured in the article. I leaned closer to the illuminated screen, the stark blue light reflecting off the glossy surface of Victor's monitor and casting long, haunting shadows across the cramped interior of our rental car. The headline practically screamed at me from the digital archive, the bold black letters burning a permanent image into my retinas. It read, "Wealthy heiress drowns on honeymoon in Miami. Husband survives tragic accident." I stared at the grainy black and white photograph positioned just below the text. The man in the picture was standing on a wooden dock, his face buried in his hands, in a perfect theatrical display of overwhelming grief for the news cameras. He was younger, his hair styled slightly differently, but the sharp angles of his jawline and the cold, predatory set of his shoulders were entirely unmistakable. It was Preston. Or rather, it was Thomas Vance perfecting his deadly craft 2 years before he ever laid eyes on my daughter. Victor began reading the details of the police report, aloud, his voice flat, clinical, and completely devoid of any emotion. The victim was a 32-year-old woman who had recently inherited a massive trust fund from her late father. They had been married for less than a month. During a private yacht charter off the beautiful Florida coast, she supposedly slipped on a wet deck and fell overboard in rough, unpredictable waters late at night. By the time the Coast Guard arrived on the scene to execute a massive search and rescue operation, it was simply too late. The autopsy found heavy traces of powerful prescription sleep aids in her system, but her new husband smoothly explained to the investigators that she had been suffering from severe anxiety and crippling insomnia leading up to the wedding. The local authorities ultimately ruled it a tragic, accidental drowning. Preston walked away a grieving widower, completely cleared of any criminal wrongdoing. He also walked away with a clean, undisputed life insurance payout of exactly $5 million wired directly into his private accounts. The sheer horror of his past washed over me, but the blinding red rage that had nearly consumed me just minutes ago in the laboratory was completely gone. In its place, a freezing, absolute clarity took hold of my mind. I was no longer dealing with a greedy con artist looking for a quick, unearned payday. I was dealing with a highly experienced, calculating, and methodical serial killer. He had done this before he had gotten away with it perfectly, and he was actively refining his deadly process to ensure he would never be caught. Maya was simply his next target, a much larger financial payout, requiring a slightly more sophisticated execution in the freezing altitudes of the Swiss Alps rather than the warm waters of Miami. But a serial killer, no matter how smooth, charming, or experienced he might appear on the surface, is fundamentally arrogant. Preston believed he was the absolute smartest man in the room. He believed he had already secured his ultimate victory. He looked at me and saw a grieving, obsolete old man he could easily sweep aside without a second thought. He did not realize he had just declared an open war on a master builder. An engineer does not panic when he suddenly discovers a fatal structural flaw in a massive building. He analyzes the complex schematics, calculates the exact mathematical loads required, and builds a permanent, unbreakable solution to completely neutralize the immediate threat. My daughter's life was the ultimate structure, and I was going to reinforce her fragile foundation with an iron cage of undeniable destructive evidence. I was going to construct a trap so meticulously detailed, so absolutely airtight, from every conceivable angle, that Preston would never see the sun again. I told Victor to print every single page of the Florida police report and carefully package it with the toxicologist's lethal chemical analysis. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the personal number for Richard Lawson. Richard had been my trusted personal estate attorney for over 25 years. He was a brilliant, razor-sharp legal mind who had expertly helped me navigate the complex zoning laws and massive corporate acquisitions that successfully built my entire commercial real estate empire. I told him it was an absolute matter of life and death, and I demanded he meet me at his private office in downtown Dallas immediately. The long, agonizing flight back to Texas was a complete blur of cold, calculated strategy. I walked into Richard's beautiful mahogany-paneled office just as the morning sun was beginning to rise over the sprawling city skyline. I did not waste a single second of our time with useless pleasantries or trivial small talk. I dropped the thick, heavy manila folder Victor had prepared directly onto the center of his polished desk. But before Richard could even attempt to look at the criminal background checks or the horrifying lethal chemical reports, I pulled a separate, perfectly crisp document from my inside suit jacket pocket. It was the terrifying medical power of attorney Preston had practically shoved in my face during our intense emotional confrontation at the penthouse. I told Richard that Preston vehemently claimed this document was merely standard procedure to protect Maya's personal assets and ensure her medical care in case of a routine unexpected emergency. I demanded Richard read every single line, every hidden clause, and every obscure footnote of the complex legal jargon. Richard adjusted his glasses and began to diligently scan the document. The large room was absolutely silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning unit and the sharp rustle of the thick legal paper. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the heavily typed pages. At first, his expression was completely neutral, analyzing the text with his usual professional detachment. But as he reached the third page, a sudden dramatic shift occurred. The healthy color began to rapidly drain from his cheeks, his jaw dropped slightly, and a thin layer of cold sweat formed on his forehead. He read the final paragraph again, tracing the tiny print with his index finger, as if he could not believe the words printed before him. He slowly lowered the document to the smooth leather surface of the desk, removing his glasses with a violently trembling hand. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine, undisguised horror. His voice shook as he finally broke the heavy silence of the office. He told me that this was not a standard protective medical proxy. It was an irrevocable ironclad death warrant wrapped in deeply deceptive legal terminology. Richard leaned forward, gripping the edges of his desk, and delivered the devastating truth. He said, "Harrison, if you allow Maya to sign this document, Preston is granted absolute, uncontested medical authority over her life. If she suffers a cardiac event and goes into a coma on that mountain, he has the sole legal right to pull the plug immediately. The document specifically strips you of all parental intervention rights. You will have absolutely zero say, and he will legally murder her while the doctors simply stand back and watch." The silence in Richard's mahogany-paneled office was absolute. I stared at the terrifying piece of paper resting on his desk, feeling a strange, paradoxical sense of calm wash over my entire body. A lesser man would have torn the document to shreds. A terrified father would have immediately called the police to stop the wedding by force. But I am an engineer. When you discover a structural vulnerability in an enemy stronghold, you do not board up the tunnel. You wire it with explosives and wait for them to walk inside. I looked Richard directly in his pale, terrified eyes and told him we were not going to block the medical power of attorney. Richard physically recoiled, reminding me that signing this document was signing my daughter's death warrant. I raised my hand to silence his rising panic. I explained that Preston was a meticulous, calculating predator who anticipated resistance. If I suddenly blocked his carefully drafted legal trap, he would immediately realize his cover was blown. He would abort the operation, drain whatever accounts he currently had access to, and vanish into the shadows before we could mount a proper offensive. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute victory. I instructed Richard to draft a secondary highly complex legal maneuver, a poison pill clause deeply buried within a completely separate trust fund document that Preston would also be required to sign at the rehearsal dinner. This invisible clause would not only immediately nullify the medical power of attorney the second his pen left the paper, but it would also instantly trigger a complete asset freeze on every single account associated with his name. Richard's breathing steadied as his brilliant legal mind grasped the sheer devastating elegance of the trap. He slowly nodded, a grim, determined smile creeping across his face. He promised the clause would be completely undetectable to anyone but a seasoned trust attorney. I left Richard furiously typing at his desk and drove straight to the heavily fortified federal building in the center of the city. I was not going to walk into a public lobby and file a generic complaint with a low-ranking desk agent. I bypassed standard security protocols and used a private phone number I had saved for 15 years. I called Marcus Thorne, the local field director for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2 decades ago, Marcus was a brilliant, highly driven young agent whose career was nearly destroyed by a corrupt bureaucratic technicality. I had utilized my considerable political influence and substantial financial resources to ensure he was treated fairly quietly, funding a massive legal defense that ultimately saved his career and allowed him to ascend to his current position of immense power. Marcus owed me a life debt, and today I was finally calling it in. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting in his secure, soundproof office. Marcus greeted me with a warm, genuine embrace, but his smile faded the exact moment he saw the cold, dead expression on my face. I opened my heavy briefcase and laid the nightmare across his desk. I showed him the toxicologist's certified report, detailing the lethal chemical cocktail of beta blockers and heavy sedatives Preston was currently feeding my daughter. I presented Victor's comprehensive algorithmic background check, exposing the completely fabricated Boston family estate and revealing Thomas Vance's real identity as a convicted felon. Finally, I slid the grainy black and white newspaper clipping from Florida across the smooth surface of the table. Marcus read the horrifying details of the previous wife's accidental drowning, his experienced eyes connecting the dark, sinister dots of the serial killer's methodology. The atmosphere in the secure room grew incredibly heavy. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He told me that this was a textbook, highly sophisticated predatory operation. He confirmed that Preston was operating a flawlessly executed long con, utilizing the jurisdictional gaps between state and international law to avoid detection. Marcus explained the harsh, unforgiving reality of the federal justice system. Despite the overwhelming mountain of circumstantial evidence Victor and I had gathered in Boston, prosecuting a man for premeditated murder before the actual crime occurred was incredibly difficult. The Florida case had been closed as an accident, and the toxicological evidence from the stolen pills could be explained away by a clever defense attorney as a pharmaceutical mix-up. Marcus looked at me with a harsh, unwavering intensity. He stated that to lock Preston away in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life, they needed to catch him committing a massive, undeniable felony in real time. The FBI agreed to sanction a full undercover sting operation, but they needed an absolute airtight trigger. Marcus explained that wire fraud and federal identity theft carried massive mandatory minimum sentences. If Preston knowingly signed those fraudulent trust documents using his fabricated alias, fully intending to extort millions of dollars from a federally insured financial institution, the Bureau could immediately raid the event. The plan was terrifyingly simple, yet incredibly dangerous. The rehearsal dinner would become the ground zero of the sting. Federal agents would infiltrate the country club, posing as waitstaff valets and audiovisual technicians. The entire private dining room would be wired with hidden high-definition cameras and directional microphones. But the entire operation hinged entirely on one solitary, fragile point of failure. Preston had to physically pick up the pen and sign his fake name on the dotted line. He had to feel completely safe, utterly confident, and entirely victorious in the exact moment he committed the fraud. If he sensed even a fraction of a millimeter of danger, if he detected a single microscopic flaw in the environment, he would refuse to sign, and the entire federal trap would instantly collapse. The immense gravity of the situation settled onto my shoulders like a suffocating blanket of lead. I left the massive federal building and drove slowly toward my expansive, empty home. The sun was beginning to dip below the Texas horizon, casting long, bloody streaks of orange and violent red across the sprawling evening sky. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled to begin in less than 4 hours. I walked into my quiet master bathroom and splashed freezing cold water over my utterly exhausted face. I stared at my own reflection in the mirror, watching the droplets of water trace the deep, aging lines around my eyes. I had to walk into an elegant, crowded dining room and break bread with the monster who was planning to murder my only child. I had to clink champagne glasses, deliver a touching, heartfelt speech, and look directly into the cold, dead eyes of a serial killer, without showing a single, solitary trace of the blinding volcanic rage boiling inside my chest. If my smile faltered for a second, if my hands trembled, or if my voice carried even a hint of venom, Preston would immediately spook and run. I adjusted my silk tie, buried the terrified father deep inside, and resurrected the ruthless, calculating engineer. I turned away from the mirror and walked out the door. The drive from my silent estate to the grand ballroom of the 5-star hotel in downtown Dallas took exactly 45 minutes. I used every single second of that commute to bury my paternal rage under a thick, impenetrable layer of projected resignation. I handed my keys to the valet, making sure my shoulders were noticeably slumped and my steps were heavy and labored. I walked through the towering glass doors and into the lavishly decorated foyer. The rehearsal dinner was a spectacular display of manufactured wealth entirely funded by my own accounts. 150 of the most elite, influential citizens in the city were gathered in the room. There were prominent real estate developers, local politicians, and wealthy socialites, all dressed in their finest evening attire. They were casually sipping expensive champagne and exchanging pleasantries, completely unaware that they were merely background extras in a meticulously staged theater of deception. I paused at the arched entrance of the ballroom, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I let my face fall into a mask of complete emotional exhaustion. I was no longer the sharp, commanding engineer who built skyscrapers. I was just a tired, defeated old man who had finally surrendered his entire legacy to the passage of time. I slowly navigated through the sea of elegantly dressed guests, offering weak, polite smiles to my colleagues and business partners. The gentle hum of classical music and polite conversation filled the cavernous room. Before I could reach the private head table, a smooth, deeply familiar voice cut through the noise. Preston materialized from the crowd wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his athletic frame flawlessly. He stepped directly into my path, a wide, magnanimous smile plastered across his handsome face. It was the radiant, utterly terrifying smile of a predator who firmly believed he had already consumed his prey. He reached out and grasped my hand in a firm, completely dominant handshake, his other hand coming up to forcefully pat my shoulder. He thanked me loudly for coming, projecting the image of a gracious, forgiving son-in-law for the benefit of the surrounding guests. He leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, and quietly whispered that he was glad I had decided to be reasonable. He smelled of expensive cologne and sheer, unadulterated arrogance. I swallowed my disgust, forcing my eyes to lower in a display of total submission. I told him quietly that I only wanted my daughter to be happy. As Preston released my hand, Valerie glided over her movements, fluid and practiced. She wore a stunning crimson evening gown that commanded the attention of half the room. She held 2 crystal flutes filled with bubbling champagne. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, gleaming with a barely concealed ravenous greed. She extended her manicured hand, offering me a glass with a perfectly rehearsed expression of familial warmth. She told me how thrilled they were to merge our families tonight, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I accepted the delicate flute, my fingers brushing against hers. I knew the horrifying truth about the woman standing before me. She was not a supportive older sister welcoming me into her circle. She was the hardened, calculating wife of a convicted felon, a willing accomplice to serial murder, eagerly anticipating her massive financial payout. I forced a polite nod, thanking her for her supposed kindness, and brought the glass to my lips without allowing a single drop of the liquid to pass my teeth. I carefully placed the untouched champagne on a passing waiter's tray. I turned my attention away from the monstrous couple and looked toward the center of the grand head table, my heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Maya was seated quietly in a high-backed velvet chair, entirely isolated amidst the swirling celebration. The physical toll of the lethal pharmaceutical cocktail was absolutely devastating. My beautiful, vibrant daughter looked like a fragile ghost of her former self. Her usually bright, expressive eyes were sunken and dull, surrounded by deep, bruised shadows. Her skin possessed a terrifying, translucent pallor, completely devoid of any healthy color. She was visibly trembling, her slender hands gripping the edge of the heavy table just to keep herself upright in the chair. She looked utterly exhausted, lost in a suffocating chemical haze that prevented her from recognizing the imminent danger surrounding her. I wanted to rush forward, tear her away from that table, and carry her out of the building. But I caught a subtle, fleeting movement out of the corner of my eye. A tall man dressed as a catering captain adjusted his earpiece. Near the back wall, a technician managing the ambient lighting subtly shifted a hidden camera lens. Marcus and his federal agents were in position entirely invisible to the untrained eye. The trap was armed and waiting. I had to hold my ground. I walked over to the head table and took my designated seat next to my daughter. Maya turned her head slowly, her movements sluggish and profoundly uncoordinated. She offered me a faint, trembling smile, whispering that she was glad I was there. I gently squeezed her cold, clammy hand silently, promising her that the nightmare was almost over. The lavish multi-course dinner began a parade of exquisite culinary creations that tasted like ash in my mouth. The elite guests laughed and drank completely oblivious to the lethal stakes playing out at the front of the room. Preston held court, charming the table with his fabricated tales of generational wealth and corporate success. He played the role of the devoted partner flawlessly, occasionally leaning over to kiss Maya's pale cheek or whisper false comforts into her ear. Every affectionate gesture he made was a calculated move to reinforce his perfect alibi. I sat quietly, eating nothing, my eyes fixed firmly on the white tablecloth. I played the broken, isolated father with absolute unwavering discipline. I let the minutes stretch into hours, waiting with the cold patience of a sniper for the designated target to step into the crosshairs. As the final dessert plates were cleared away by the undercover federal agents, the ambient noise in the ballroom began to naturally settle. Preston elegantly rose from his chair, a fresh glass of champagne held high in his right hand. He tapped his silver spoon against the crystal rim. The ringing instantly captured the room. 150 influential guests fell completely silent, turning their expectant faces toward the head table. Preston smiled warmly, his charismatic gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd, before finally resting entirely on me. He spoke with a booming, theatrical voice that echoed off the high ceilings. He announced that before the dancing began, my wonderful father-in-law had a special, profound gift to officially present to the new couple. He proclaimed it was the formal signing of the family trust. Preston reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He slid the lethal medical power of attorney and a heavy gold pen slowly across the polished wood, directly toward my hands. The entire room watched in absolute silence. The heavy gold pen felt cold and foreign against the rough calluses of my aging fingers. I picked it up, slowly turning it over in my hand, as if evaluating the sheer weight of the metal. The entire room remained suspended in a breathless, expectant silence. 150 influential pairs of eyes were completely fixed on me, waiting for the defeated patriarch to officially sign away his empire and retreat into the shadows. I looked up from the leather-bound portfolio and shifted my gaze toward my daughter. Maya was slumping sideways in her velvet chair, her eyelids fluttering heavily as she fought a losing battle against the massive dose of invisible pharmaceutical sedatives coursing through her bloodstream. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that the document resting in front of me was a legally binding death warrant designed to orchestrate her murder on a freezing European mountain. I tore my eyes away from her pale, fragile face and looked directly at Preston. He was leaning forward over the white tablecloth, his immaculate posture betraying a deeply primal, predatory hunger. He was practically salivating, his dark eyes tracking the gold pen in my hand with an intense, intoxicating greed. He believed he had calculated every variable, anticipating my emotional surrender and exploiting my parental love to secure his $10 million payout. Valerie sat beside him, mirroring his poorly concealed anticipation, her fingers tightly gripping the stem of her champagne flute. They were waiting for the final definitive stroke of ink that would cement their ultimate victory. I let the silence stretch for another agonizing moment, holding their gaze with a perfectly blank expression. I did not rush. I allowed the heavy, suffocating pressure of the room to build until it felt almost tactile. I slowly shifted my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the polished marble floor. I stood up to my full height, straightening my shoulders and shedding the meticulously crafted illusion of the tired, broken old man. I reached across the table and pulled the slender silver stem of the floral centerpiece microphone closer to my mouth. I knew Marcus and his entire team of undercover federal agents were listening through their hidden earpieces, waiting for the precise audio trigger to launch the sting operation. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, rhythmic thud echoed like a gavel, striking a sounding block across the cavernous ballroom. The elite guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing a sudden, inexplicable change in the atmospheric pressure. I looked at the crowd, then brought my gaze back to Preston, locking onto his eyes with the cold, unyielding precision of a master architect, analyzing a critical structural failure. I spoke with a deep, resonant voice that easily carried to the farthest corners of the room. 40 years ago, I built my first skyscraper. I paused, letting the profound weight of that statement settle over the silent audience. I explained that the fundamental rule of commercial engineering is incredibly simple. You can use the most expensive materials in the world, you can hire the most brilliant designers, and you can polish the exterior glass until it shines like a diamond in the sun. But if the foundational concrete is poured over unstable soil, the entire edifice is fundamentally doomed. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on Preston as I continued. A structure built on a lie will always collapse under the immense weight of its own deception. A subtle, dangerous shift occurred in Preston's carefully maintained demeanor. His smug, victorious smile faltered, replaced by a rigid, barely perceptible tightening of his jawline. He recognized the sudden shift in my tone. The underlying threat, embedded in my architectural metaphor, was not lost on a man who had spent his entire adult life building elaborate illusions to trap vulnerable women. He glanced quickly toward the exit doors, his survival instincts finally beginning to whisper warnings into his ear. I refused to break eye contact, increasing the vocal pressure, letting the sheer volcanic rage I had been suppressing finally bleed into my carefully chosen words. I told the captivated room that a family is exactly like a massive steel structure. It requires unshakable honesty, absolute transparency, and a foundation forged in genuine love to survive the turbulent storms of life. When parasites infiltrate that structure, when they systematically chip away at the load-bearing walls and replace the solid steel with toxic manipulation, the building becomes a deadly hazard to everyone residing inside. I raised the gold pen into the air, presenting it to the silent crowd like a piece of irrefutable criminal evidence. I stated that the document sitting on the table was not a standard trust agreement designed to protect my daughter. I declared that it was a highly sophisticated, meticulously engineered snare, drafted by a man who had perfected the art of predatory destruction long before he ever set foot in the state of Texas. A low, collective murmur of profound confusion swept through the ballroom. The wealthy guests exchanged incredibly bewildered glances, completely unsure if this was a bizarre, heavily scripted part of the rehearsal entertainment or a catastrophic public meltdown. Valerie completely lost her composure. She abruptly stood up from her chair, her crimson gown rustling loudly against the fabric, her face a mask of furious indignation. She desperately attempted to interrupt me, raising her voice to loudly suggest that the emotional stress of the upcoming wedding had clearly caused me to suffer a severe mental breakdown. She reached across the table, frantically attempting to snatch the leather portfolio away from my grasp. I slammed my left hand down onto the document, pinning it flat against the table with a violent, booming force that made the crystal glasses rattle and instantly silenced her frantic protests. I looked directly at Valerie, completely stripping away the final remnants of my polite, socially acceptable facade. I told her to sit down and remain silent before she deeply regretted her action. She froze, her eyes widening in sudden terror as she recognized the sheer menace radiating from my posture. I turned my attention back to Preston. His face was completely drained of color. He was slowly pushing his chair backward, preparing to bolt for the nearest emergency exit. He knew the game was entirely over. He had stepped directly into the snare, and the steel jaws were rapidly closing around his throat. I held the gold pen poised over the signature line of the deadly medical power of attorney. The entire room collectively held its breath, waiting for the final decisive action. I looked at the man who had actively planned to murder my only child on a freezing European mountain for a $10 million payout. I smiled, letting the predatory wolf finally show its teeth. I simply dropped the heavy pen. It clattered loudly against the polished wood, rolling away from the fraudulent document. I reached deep into my suit pocket, pulling out my cellular phone. I did not say another word. I stared into Preston's panicked eyes and deliberately tapped one button on the illuminated screen. Instantly, every single light in the grand ballroom went completely dark. The sudden darkness plunged the grand ballroom into a state of absolute sensory deprivation. For a fraction of a second, the only sound in the cavernous space was the sharp collective intake of breath from 150 of the city's elite guests. The sudden absence of the glittering chandeliers left a heavy, suffocating weight hanging over the white tablecloths. I remained standing perfectly still in the pitch black, my eyes adjusting rapidly to the absence of light. I could hear the faint, nervous rustling of silk evening gowns and the uncomfortable shifting of leather shoes against the marble floor. Beside me, I heard Preston let out a short, dismissive breath, an arrogant scoff in the dark. He muttered something under his breath about a blown fuse or a technical malfunction with the hotel catering staff. He still believed he was in complete control of the narrative. He still thought this was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to his flawless victory lap. He had absolutely no idea that I had just detonated the explosive charges beneath his carefully constructed foundation. Then a low mechanical hum began to vibrate from the ceiling above the far end of the room. It was the heavy rhythmic whir of the massive ceiling-mounted digital projector powering on. A blinding high-definition beam of pure white light sliced through the darkness, cutting directly over the heads of the bewildered guests and striking the massive canvas screen positioned directly behind the head table. The sudden illumination cast long, distorted silhouettes across the walls. The crowd murmured in anticipation, shifting in their seats, expecting a romantic montage of the happy couple. They were waiting for a carefully curated slideshow of smiling vacations, sunset dinners, and manufactured memories. Instead, the very first image that flashed onto the massive screen was a high-resolution scan of a legal document, magnified so largely that the crisp black text was entirely legible from the absolute back row of the dining hall. The bright light washed over the upturned faces of the audience, illuminating their expressions of polite curiosity. It took exactly 3 seconds for the collective realization to set in. The document projected behind us was the marriage certificate from Clark County, Nevada. The names Thomas Vance and Valerie Vance were printed in bold, undeniable letters directly above their legal signatures, accompanied by the official government seal and the filing date from 8 years ago. A sharp, unified gasp erupted from the center of the room. It rolled through the crowd like a shockwave, a physical manifestation of their sudden, jarring comprehension. The influential politicians, the wealthy developers, and the high society patrons sat frozen, their champagne flutes hovering forgotten in the air. The illusion of the supportive, loving older sister was instantly shattered, broadcasted in 10-foot-high letters for the entire city to witness. I turned my head slowly to look at Valerie. The projected light painted her face in a harsh, unflattering glow. She was staring at the screen with her mouth hanging open, the color rapidly draining from her cheeks until her skin resembled chalk. She looked like a trapped animal, paralyzed by the sudden blinding spotlight. Preston jumped out of his chair, sending it crashing backward onto the floor. He desperately began waving his arms, shouting into the darkness for someone to cut the power, claiming it was a malicious prank or a terrible forgery. But his smooth, charismatic voice was now laced with a shrill, unmistakable thread of pure panic. The mask was slipping, cracking under the immense pressure of public exposure. I ignored his frantic shouting and kept my hand resting casually inside my pocket. I pressed the small button on my phone a second time. The projector clicked loudly, advancing the presentation to the next slide. The marriage certificate vanished instantly, replaced by a split screen. On the left side was the grainy Florida newspaper clipping, detailing the tragic honeymoon drowning of a wealthy heiress. On the right side was the official medical examiner's autopsy report, clearly highlighting the massive presence of heavy sleep aids in the victim's bloodstream. The headline declaring the grieving husband's survival was magnified, and an arrow pointed directly from the name Thomas Vance in the police report to a high-quality, undeniable photograph of Preston standing on that Miami dock 2 years ago. The murmurs in the ballroom escalated into loud, frantic whispers. The guests were no longer just confused. They were terrified. They were looking at a man they had just shared a meal with and realizing they were dining with a predator. The air in the room grew cold, thick with the undeniable reality of premeditated murder. I watched the prominent real estate developers leaning away from the head table, physically distancing themselves from the monster, standing at the center of the room. Preston was spinning in circles, his hands pulling desperately at his hair, screaming for the hotel management to stop the projector. He was completely losing his mind, his perfect, unshakable facade entirely dismantled by the undeniable truth shining brightly behind him. I pressed the button on my phone for the third and final time. The screen flashed again, delivering the fatal, crushing blow. The image shifted to the certified toxicological report from Dr. Eris Thorne. The stark clinical text detailed the exact chemical breakdown of the massive dose of beta blockers and hypnotic sedatives. Positioned directly next to the laboratory results was a crystal-clear photograph of the blue capsules sitting inside the amber prescription bottle labeled Maya's Supplements. The text on the screen clearly explained how the chemical cocktail was specifically engineered to induce a massive cardiac arrest at high altitudes, mimicking a natural tragic death in the mountains. The ballroom erupted into absolute uncontained chaos. Chairs were shoved aside as guests scrambled to their feet. Shouts of horror and disbelief echoed against the high ceilings. Women covered their mouths and men yelled for someone to call the police. The elegant, sophisticated rehearsal dinner had been instantly transformed into a terrifying theater of criminal exposure. But the most profound reaction did not come from the wealthy crowd. It came from the empty chair next to me. The sudden screaming, the blinding light from the projector, and the chaotic energy vibrating through the room finally pierced the heavy, suffocating chemical fog enveloping my daughter's mind. The massive spike of pure adrenaline cut through the heavy sedatives. Maya's head snapped up. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She braced her hands against the polished wood of the table, her knuckles turning white, as she forced herself to sit completely upright. She slowly turned her head, her sunken, exhausted eyes tracing the massive letters on the bright screen. She read the toxicologist's report. The devastating reality crashed down upon her, shattering the beautiful manufactured illusion of her perfect romance. She turned her gaze away from the screen and looked directly at the man she had planned to marry. Preston stood frozen at the head table. He looked at my daughter, whose eyes were wide with absolute terror. He realized he had walked blind into a slaughterhouse. There was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom held for a fraction of a second before the sickening reality of the projected images shattered the elegant atmosphere. Valerie was the very first person to react to the blinding exposure. The sophisticated, warm illusion of the loving sister evaporated in an instant, replaced entirely by the primal, terrified instinct of a cornered animal. She kicked her velvet chair backward, the heavy wood scraping violently against the polished marble floor, and bolted toward the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. She moved with a sudden, desperate speed, the heavy silk of her crimson evening gown tearing slightly as her expensive heels slipped on the smooth stone. She clearly thought she saw a fleeting opening, a narrow, unguarded escape route into the dark service corridors that would lead her safely down to the underground parking garage. But she had severely underestimated the ironclad perimeter I had quietly established around the room. As her hands crashed desperately against the swinging doors, a massive, unyielding shadow stepped directly into her path. It was Victor. He did not issue a verbal warning, nor did he attempt to read her constitutional rights. He simply reached out with one massive calloused hand, grabbed the thick fabric of her expensive dress right at the shoulder, and spun her around with terrifying, unstoppable momentum. He slammed her back against the reinforced structural wall with a heavy, sickening thud. The breath left her lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. Victor pinned her securely there, his face an impenetrable mask of cold, professional fury, effectively neutralizing her frantic escape before she even made it out of the chaotic dining room. The surrounding elite guests screamed and scattered in blind panic. I did not waste a single glance on Valerie. My eyes remained entirely locked on Preston. The devastating, undeniable realization of his absolute defeat triggered a horrifying, physical transformation. His handsome, charismatic facade literally melted away right in front of my eyes, revealing the psychotic, cold-blooded killer hiding underneath the expensive tuxedo. His jaw clenched so tightly I could practically hear the violent grinding of his teeth over the rising screams of the crowd. The smooth, calculated suitor who had so easily charmed his way into my daughter's vulnerable life was completely gone, replaced by a cornered predator, suddenly realizing the steel trap had irrevocably closed around his neck. He looked wildly at the massive projector screen displaying his past crimes, then looked down at the heavy gold pen resting uselessly on the white tablecloth. The federal agents posing as catering waiters and lighting technicians were slowly closing the perimeter, moving purposefully through the panicked, scattering crowd, with their hands hovering dangerously near their concealed weapons. Preston knew he was completely surrounded, but his supreme pathological arrogance refused to let him surrender quietly. A feral, guttural scream ripped from his throat, a horrifying sound completely devoid of any human empathy or rational thought. He planted his large hands firmly on the white tablecloth and vaulted directly over the head table, sending heavy silver cutlery, crystal champagne flutes, and elaborate floral arrangements crashing violently to the floor. He lunged directly at me, his fingers curled into tight, murderous fists, aiming to tear me apart in a final desperate act of violent retaliation. He fully expected me to cower in fear, to shrink back in terror, like the defeated, broken old man I had expertly pretended to be all evening long. I did not flinch. I did not step back, and I absolutely did not raise my hands in a defensive posture. Throughout the entire agonizing evening, I had been leaning heavily on a thick, solid oak walking cane to physically sell the deceptive illusion of my rapidly declining health and extreme physical vulnerability. Preston had completely dismissed the heavy cane as a pathetic, necessary prop of my advancing old age. He was fundamentally, fatally wrong. It was a perfectly weighted, incredibly dense structural weapon. As he rapidly closed the short distance between us, his handsome face contorted in blind, murderous rage, I smoothly shifted my body weight and planted my feet with the steady, grounded balance of a seasoned master builder. I gripped the polished brass handle of the heavy cane tightly with both hands, pivoted my hips, and swung the solid oak shaft with every single ounce of physical strength I possessed. I did not aim for his head or his broad chest. I mathematically calculated the exact downward trajectory required to completely neutralize his forward momentum. The heavy wood struck him squarely across the fragile side of his left kneecap. The physical impact was absolutely deafening, a sharp structural crack of breaking bone that clearly echoed above the screaming crowd. Preston's violent forward momentum abruptly collapsed. The complex joint entirely shattered under the immense unyielding force of the targeted blow. His furious scream of rage instantly morphed into a high-pitched, agonizing howl of pure physical pain as his leg buckled violently beneath him. He crashed incredibly hard onto the cold marble floor, completely incapacitated, desperately clutching his ruined knee as the undercover federal agents immediately surged forward from the surrounding shadows. The federal operatives rapidly swarmed the front of the dining room, their voices booming with absolute authority, directing the remaining terrified guests to stay back and ordering Preston to remain completely still on the ground. The bright flashing red and blue lights of multiple local police cruisers suddenly illuminated the tall glass windows of the grand ballroom, casting shadows across the beautifully decorated walls. The massive snare had sprung with flawless mechanical precision. But even as he lay writhing on the cold stone floor, entirely surrounded by armed federal law enforcement officers, Preston's arrogance simply refused to die. He looked up at me, his face pale and contorted in pure physical agony, panting heavily through his tightly clenched teeth. He sneered, attempting a pathetic imitation of his former smug superiority. He violently spat the desperate words out into the air, trying to reclaim some tiny fraction of situational control. He yelled at the top of his lungs that I had absolutely nothing on him. He screamed that I was merely a crazy, paranoid old man who had just viciously assaulted him in front of over 100 credible witnesses. He pointed a violently trembling finger at the dark leather portfolio, resting entirely undisturbed on the white tablecloth above him. He shouted that he did not actually sign anything yet, and without his physical signature firmly written on that fraudulent legal document, I could never legally prove his specific intent to commit federal wire fraud. He truly believed he had successfully found the singular microscopic legal loophole in my engineered snare. I slowly lowered my oak cane, deliberately stepping closer to the edge of the polished table. I leaned down carefully, bringing my mouth just inches away from the silver floral microphone. I looked directly down at the broken, miserable creature bleeding on the floor, and I spoke with a quiet, absolute certainty that crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. I simply stared right down into his pathetic eyes and firmly stated, "Oh, but you did." The sharp feedback of the microphone echoed through the massive ballroom as my words hung in the chilling air. The face of Preston contorted in a grotesque mixture of physical agony and absolute confusion. He clutched his shattered knee, his chest heaving as he stared up at me from the cold marble floor. He desperately tried to process what I had just said, his mind racing to find the logical flaw in my statement. He wheezed through his teeth, demanding to know what I meant, insisting once again that his signature was not on any binding contract. I stepped around the wreckage of the silver cutlery and crystal champagne flutes scattered across the floor. I looked down at the pathetic predator writhing at my feet and delivered the final crushing blow to his crumbling foundation. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a man who had successfully reinforced a load-bearing wall against a Category 5 hurricane. I told him that he was entirely correct about the specific family trust document currently resting on the table. He had not signed it yet. But his narrow, arrogant mind was entirely focused on the wrong trap. I informed him that wire fraud and extortion were never the primary charges I was truly interested in bringing against him. Those were merely the secondary mechanisms designed to guarantee federal jurisdiction over his inevitable prosecution. I leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring that every single guest, every undercover operative, and my terrified daughter heard the absolute truth. I asked Preston a simple, devastating question. I asked him if he honestly believed he was actually poisoning the vitamins of Maya over the last 72 hours. The color rapidly drained from what was left of his flushed face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. His eyes darted toward Maya, who was sitting perfectly still in her velvet chair, listening to my every word with a dawning sense of horrifying clarity. I did not give Preston a single second to formulate a deceptive response. I raised my voice, letting the unyielding authority of a protective father fill the cavernous space. I revealed that I had broken into their supposedly impenetrable luxury penthouse 3 days ago, while they were completely distracted by their fraudulent wedding preparations. I explained how easily I had bypassed his expensive, military-grade smart lock, circumvented his security cameras, and located the hidden steel safe concealed behind the false drywall in his private home office. I watched the absolute terror finally eclipse the pain in the dark eyes of Preston. He suddenly understood the catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation. I detailed how I had carefully cracked the mechanical dial of his fireproof safe, extracting the cheap plastic tray hidden inside. I told him I had found the amber prescription bottle labeled with the name of my daughter. I explained that I had taken the deadly blue capsules directly to a private independent toxicologist to confirm their highly lethal chemical composition. And then I executed the most critical phase of my entire structural counterattack. I looked Preston directly in his panicked eyes and told him I had meticulously swapped every single one of his heavily sedated toxic pills with completely harmless inert placebos. A collective gasp of absolute shock rippled through the gathered crowd of elite socialites and prominent politicians. The horrific reality of the premeditated murder plot was now undeniable. I continued my merciless deconstruction of his criminal empire. I stated that the actual poison he had carefully acquired to orchestrate the fatal heart attack of my daughter on a freezing European mountain was no longer in his possession. I had personally handed the lethal chemical cocktail directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along perfectly with the disposable burner phone he had used to covertly order the deadly substances. I explained that federal forensic technicians had already extracted his digital fingerprints, his encrypted text messages, and his precise cellular geolocation data from that device. He had unknowingly provided the federal authorities with a flawlessly documented, irrefutable confession of his own malicious intent. Maya let out a sharp, trembling breath. The heavy, suffocating fog that had clouded her mind for weeks was rapidly dissipating, replaced by the sheer, terrifying gravity of her near execution. She stared at the man she had loved, the man who had whispered hollow promises of a beautiful future while methodically feeding her a lethal dose of pharmaceutical poison. Preston tried to push himself backward across the marble floor, dragging his shattered knee behind him in a pathetic attempt to escape the blinding spotlight of his own exposure. He was completely trapped, a rat caught in a meticulously engineered steel snare. Before Preston could formulate a final desperate lie, the heavy double oak doors at the rear entrance of the grand ballroom burst violently open. The loud resounding crash echoed like a thunderclap, instantly shattering the remaining tension in the room. A dozen heavily armed federal agents stormed into the elegant dining hall. Their dark tactical gear struck a sharp, terrifying contrast against the formal evening attire of the panicked guests. The lead agent, Field Director Marcus Thorne, marched directly down the center aisle with unwavering, absolute authority. He pointed a commanding finger at the bleeding man on the floor and ordered his operatives to secure the primary suspect immediately. 2 massive federal agents lunged forward, grabbing Preston by his tailored tuxedo jacket and hauling him roughly to his feet. He screamed in pure, unadulterated agony as his shattered kneecap bore his shifting weight. They slammed him face first against the polished mahogany of the head table, forcing his arms aggressively behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the silent room with absolute finality. Preston thrashed wildly against their iron grip, his former charismatic composure entirely replaced by the frantic, pathetic flailing of a defeated criminal. He screamed desperately, hurling vicious, incoherent threats into the air, as his entire fraudulent life was completely, irreversibly destroyed. Simultaneously, a second tactical team converged on the dark service corridor near the catering kitchen. The heavy swinging doors flew open as Victor forcefully marched Valerie back inside. Valerie was pushed into the main ballroom. Her beautiful crimson evening gown was torn, her perfectly styled hair completely disheveled. She was screaming frantically, fighting against the heavy steel cuffs securing her wrists, demanding to speak to a lawyer. The federal agents ignored her completely hysterical protests, flanking her sides and forcefully marching her toward the main exit alongside her fake brother. They were both dragged away into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers, their elaborate deadly masquerade permanently terminated. I turned my full attention away from the departing criminals and looked down at my daughter. Maya was trembling violently, her pale hands clutching the edges of the white tablecloth. The horrifying realization of how close she had come to a lonely, tragic death finally crashed down upon her. She let out a ragged, heartbreaking sob, collapsing entirely into my waiting open arms. I held her tightly, completely securing my beautiful, entirely terrified and profoundly relieved only child. The chaotic frenzy of the grand ballroom slowly dissolved into a stark, echoing emptiness. The terrified elite guests, once eager participants in a manufactured celebration of wealth, had completely scattered into the cold night air, leaving behind a profound scene of opulent devastation. Overturned velvet chairs, shattered crystal champagne flutes, and trampled floral arrangements littered the polished marble floor, like casualties of a silent war. The heavy double oak doors remained propped wide open, allowing the cool, sobering draft from the hotel lobby to finally sweep away the lingering scent of expensive cologne and artificial sweetness. A small, highly disciplined team of federal agents lingered near the catering kitchen, meticulously bagging the fraudulent legal documents and securing the ruined tables as formal, irrefutable evidence. The bright, flashing red and blue lights of the local police cruisers had faded from the towering glass windows, replaced by the steady, unyielding glow of the distant city skyline, a testament to the enduring reality that existed far beyond this isolated nightmare. I remained seated at the head table, the epicenter of the shattered illusion, wrapping my suit jacket securely around the trembling shoulders of my daughter. The massive digital projector behind us had been powered down, plunging the massive canvas screen back into absolute forgiving darkness. Maya leaned her heavy head against my chest, her breathing finally slowing to a steady, natural rhythm as the last remaining traces of the lethal sedatives were slowly metabolized by her exhausted system. The nightmare had been forcefully, permanently terminated. We were completely alone in the cavernous room, surrounded by the physical wreckage of a perfectly executed deception, but the suffocating atmospheric pressure had been entirely lifted. Maya shifted slightly, her pale hands reaching up to grasp the fabric of my lapel. She lifted her head, her beautiful, expressive eyes searching my face with a heartbreaking mixture of profound gratitude and overwhelming guilt. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, catching the dim ambient light from the foyer. She spoke with a fragile, trembling voice, the words catching painfully in her dry throat. She apologized. She repeated the word over and over, burying her face into my chest, weeping for the beautiful lie she had so desperately wanted to believe. She told me she was incredibly sorry for pushing me away during the last 6 months, for dismissing my valid concerns, and for blindly accusing me of being a jealous, paranoid old man who simply refused to let her grow up. She confessed that Preston had systematically isolated her, filling her head with subtle, poisonous whispers that I was trying to control her inheritance and ruin her happiness. She sobbed, her small frame shaking violently, asking how she could have been so incredibly foolish, how she could have looked into the eyes of a cold-blooded killer every single day and seen nothing but a devoted, loving partner. I gently stroked her hair, kissing the top of her head, with a fierce, unconditional love that transcended any temporary anger or past misunderstanding. I kept my voice low, steady, and infinitely reassuring, anchoring her firmly to the present reality. I told her that she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. I explained that predators like Preston and Valerie did not select their victims because those victims were weak or foolish. They targeted people like her precisely because she possessed a kind, trusting, and beautifully empathetic heart. They weaponized her best qualities, using her inherent goodness as a blindfold to completely obscure their true malevolent intentions from her sight. I tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet my gaze. I told her that my only job in this entire world, from the very first moment I held her in the hospital delivery room, was to be her unyielding shield. I stated that a father does not stop protecting his child just because the child believes they are perfectly safe. I explained that I would gladly tear down every single skyscraper I had ever built, burn my entire fortune to ash, and willingly step into the line of fire 1,000 times over to ensure that she drew her next breath. The immense, crushing weight of the last 3 days finally lifted from my shoulders as I watched the genuine comprehension and profound relief settle into her exhausted features. She wrapped her arms around my neck, holding me with a desperate, crushing strength, finally anchoring herself to the only man in her life who had never lied to her. We sat together in the silent, ruined ballroom for another hour, allowing the pure adrenaline to completely fade from our systems. A quiet, respectful federal agent eventually approached the table politely, informing us that our formal statements had been fully processed, and we were officially cleared to return to our private estate. I nodded, thanking him for his absolute professionalism. I stood up slowly, leaning my weight onto my solid oak cane, the adrenaline crash finally reminding my aging joints of the severe physical toll of the evening. I extended my free hand to Maya. She took it firmly, her grip steady and remarkably strong. Together we slowly navigated through the chaotic debris of the rehearsal dinner, walking past the shattered remnants of a deadly illusion and stepping out through the grand arched entrance. We walked through the luxurious hotel foyer, our footsteps echoing softly against the polished marble, leaving the dark, treacherous chapter of our lives permanently behind us. We stepped out through the towering glass doors and into the crisp, refreshing night air of downtown Dallas, taking deep, cleansing breaths that filled our lungs with the undeniable sensation of total freedom. The dark, menacing storm that had threatened to completely consume our family had finally passed, leaving behind a clear, brilliant sky illuminated by 1,000,000 distant stars. The extensive generational fortune I had spent my entire life building was completely secure, entirely insulated from the greedy, blood-stained hands of predatory monsters. The highly complex trust documents and the lethal medical power of attorney had been permanently seized as prime federal evidence destined to rot in an evidence locker for eternity. Preston and Valerie were currently sitting in cold, isolated federal interrogation rooms, facing a towering mountain of irrefutable, completely damning physical evidence. The federal prosecutors were already preparing a massive indictment that included multiple counts of attempted murder, interstate wire fraud, and severe conspiracy charges. They were staring down the absolute certainty of serving out the remainder of their miserable lives in a grim maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of parole. Their names would be entirely erased from our history, reduced to a brief, terrifying cautionary tale. I looked over at my daughter as the valet brought my car around to the grand entrance. The brutal, unforgiving ordeal had stripped away her naivete, but it had not broken her spirit. The profound bond between a father and his daughter had been tested by the most absolute malicious evil imaginable, and it had emerged from the searing fire forged in unbreakable pure steel. We climbed into the quiet safety of the waiting car, completely ready to finally go home and safely begin the rest of our lives. A full year has passed since that remarkably dark, chaotic night in downtown Dallas, and the quiet, comforting peace has finally returned to our silent estate. The federal trial was remarkably swift, operating as a highly efficient, unstoppable machine of absolute justice. Faced with the staggering mountain of overwhelming physical evidence, the certified toxicology reports from the independent laboratory, the recovered burner phones, and the newly unearthed undeniable connections to the tragic Florida murder, Preston and Valerie completely abandoned their arrogant facades. They both rapidly took a desperate plea deal to avoid the impending threat of the death penalty. They will now spend the absolute unyielding remainder of their natural adult lives quietly rotting inside the sterile, windowless walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary. They filed a pathetic, desperate legal appeal 6 months later, loudly claiming that I had maliciously set them up and completely fabricated the digital evidence. But the federal judge literally laughed them out of the stark, silent courtroom. Maya moved back into our sprawling family home for a few incredibly quiet, intensely healing months. It was a slow, delicate process of profound physical and emotional recovery. I watched the heavy, toxic brain fog gradually clear from her beautiful mind. The vibrant, healthy color finally returned to her pale cheeks, completely replacing the terrifying, translucent pallor that had constantly haunted my nightmares. Today, her contemporary art gallery is thriving, beautifully, far more successful than ever before, filled with bright, welcoming light and genuine, honest success. We spend all of our Sunday mornings sitting calmly together on the wide wooden porch, drinking rich, warm coffee and talking comfortably about absolutely everything and nothing at all. I did not just miraculously save my beloved daughter's life that unforgettable night. I successfully got my absolute best friend back from the very brink of the dark, treacherous abyss. The deep emotional scars will inevitably take time to fully heal, but we are absolutely committed to walking that beautiful path of recovery side by side, every single day together. There is also a very specific, deeply personal detail I must clearly mention regarding Dominic, the brilliant, highly observant master tailor who physically pushed me into that cramped fitting room and forcefully demanded that I listen to the horrifying truth. That brave, inherently good man has never had to pay for a single round of drinks or a decent hot meal in this entire sprawling city ever again. I personally made absolutely sure of that small, righteous, incredibly important detail. Sometimes the vast, unpredictable universe suddenly hands you a profound, life-saving miracle tightly wrapped inside a terrifying, unbearable nightmare. When that incredibly rare moment arrives, you must never panic. You simply have to stay perfectly quiet, listen carefully to the hidden, malicious whispers of the enemy, and meticulously prepare your definitive structural counterattack. To any fiercely devoted parent out there currently listening to my story right now, I urgently need you to remember one incredibly important fundamental rule. Never let the temporary paralyzing fear of pushing your children away artificially stop you from deeply trusting your ingrained, protective parental gut. Dangerous, calculating, incredibly patient predators absolutely do not come clearly marked with obvious, flashing warning labels. They arrive beautifully disguised as absolutely everything your exceptionally vulnerable child has ever wanted in their entire life. They expertly use charismatic, overwhelming charm as a highly lethal weapon, and they deliberately employ cruel emotional isolation as their primary destructive psychological tool. If a brand new, seemingly charming individual suddenly enters your close family circle, and the established dynamics instantly turn dark and undeniably toxic, if your once vibrant, independent child drastically changes their fundamental behavior and personality, do not just politely step aside and quietly mind your own personal business. You must actively, aggressively investigate the threatening shadows. Ask the incredibly hard, deeply uncomfortable questions that no one else is brave enough to ever ask aloud. It is infinitely better to be temporarily viewed as the unreasonable, paranoid, controlling villain in their young, naive eyes for a single difficult month than to tragically, helplessly mourn their completely avoidable death for the absolute unending rest of your broken life. If this incredibly specific, intense, true story clearly proved to you that a fiercely protective father's unyielding love is the ultimate unbreakable shield against the absolute darkest evils of the modern world, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel today so you never miss hearing more incredible true stories of unbelievable survival, profound family bonds, and absolute, undeniable justice. Tell me down in the comments section below exactly what specific city you are currently watching this video from today. I sincerely love reading all of your wonderful responses. I will officially see you in the next video. Stay completely safe out there.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.